Hi, for those of you who have joined already, I'm Dan McKean, and this is the webinar for the MongoDB Atlas Kubernetes operator. We're going to give everyone a couple of minutes to join, and then we'll actually get started. For those of you just joining, our attending numbers are just still creeping up. So we're going to give it another minute, and then we'll actually get started. Thank you. Cool. I think we're ready to start now. Oh, very cool. We've even got someone from New Zealand, one of my favorite places in the world. Cool. Thank you for joining, and welcome to this webinar about the MongoDB Atlas Kubernetes operator. My name is Dan McKean, and I'm one of MongoDB's product managers. I'm responsible for our support of Kubernetes, so self-hosted in Kubernetes using our enterprise or community Kubernetes operators, or using our Atlas Kubernetes operator, which is what we're going to be covering here today. So before we get started, a few quick bits of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and shared. We'll share it out to all of you following this, and please feel free to pass on that recording to anyone who's interested. All participants are automatically muted just to ensure the quality of the webinar for everyone. But we do strongly encourage you to participate, so please ask questions in the Q&A box. And for live comments, please use the chat in the Zoom control panel. And lastly, we'd love to know how useful this was for you, so please do fill out the short survey that we'll advertise at the end. So in this webinar, I'm going to take a relatively high-level look at the Atlas operator. We'll start with why it was created, how it works, the benefits, how to get started using it, where and how you can learn more, and then we'll wrap up with hopefully at least 10 minutes of Q&A time. So please do get your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom. So the story of the Atlas operator started a little over 2 years ago with the realization that there was a challenge some of our customers were facing. They all thought Atlas was awesome, which we're very glad about. But there were many that wanted, many who also loved Kubernetes, And we also think Kubernetes is awesome. But there were many who wanted to align the way that they managed Atlas with how they were already managing their application stack in Kubernetes. And so we were left wondering, how can we make them awesome together? We started off by looking at the challenges and the requirements that customers mentioned when they talked about managing both their Kubernetes stack and Atlas. The first was consistent tooling. Developers were often using one set of tools to manage their stack in Kubernetes and another tool to manage configuration for Atlas. That's not necessarily a bad thing if you're already using something like Terraform or CloudFormation, both of which we already support. But if you're not, then it can be a pain to have to adopt a new technology. Security was a requirement that came up from all. In particular, everybody wanted to minimize system permissions. Governance and policy enforcement came up a lot too, ensuring centralized oversight of infrastructure configuration. Change control kind of goes hand in hand with both security and governance, but often serves a more practical purpose, such as finding out what went wrong and potentially rolling back. Although Atlas itself has great audit logs, customers wanted a method of reviewing changes and rolling back that was more consistent with their existing processes and tooling. And some mentioned that infrastructure drift was a problem. Small, untracked changes were made to systems over time that eventually caused big problems, and manual configuration was often the cause of this. Automation was another high priority requirement. It helps ensure repeatable, consistent, and reliable infrastructure deployments. And perhaps the most impactful of all, self-service. This was one of the top requirements. Effective self-service can drive innovation, reduce time to market, and increase developer retention. And as you probably already know, and you can definitely see here, managing infrastructure comes with a long list of considerations. We wanted to simplify that, if only for customers using Kubernetes and Atlas side by side. So after lots of discussion, we landed on building an operator. For those who aren't already aware, a Kubernetes operator is a service built to extend the default control plane of Kubernetes to support the custom logic of a specific application. In the case of this operator, Atlas. Most operators manage services running within the Kubernetes cluster, for example, our enterprise operator running Enterprise Advanced, but the Atlas operator is a little different. The Atlas operator itself is installed within a Kubernetes cluster. Ideally, this is the same cluster where the application using Atlas is running, as the operator automatically creates Kubernetes secrets containing the database connection string that the application needs. We'll cover that a little bit more later. The operator supports creation and configuration of projects, deployments, users, and teams. And to create a new resource in Atlas, you start by creating a YAML file, which you then apply into Kubernetes. The operator can be configured to watch one, many, or all namespaces within the cluster. So as long as the file is applied into a namespace watched by the operator, it will leap into action to apply your configuration. It does this by reading the custom resource and then calling the Atlas admin API to create the corresponding object in Atlas. In this case, it was a deployment. So while the basic functionality of the operator itself is fairly simple, a massive part of its value is in how using the operator allows you to manage Atlas using your existing processes and tooling that you already know work well with Kubernetes. For example, a code management system like GitHub or Bitbucket can be used to manage the custom resource YAML files used with the operator. In this way, they're treated as infrastructure as code, often abbreviated to IAC, and housed in a repository. This has a number of familiar benefits. Change control becomes as easy for Atlas infrastructure as it already is for managing application code changes. Since the files in the repository become the source of truth about the Atlas configuration, this also helps prevent unplanned changes that can lead to infrastructure drift. And since it's on an operator, it already helps with infrastructure drift. The operator does periodic reconciles to ensure that the Atlas configuration has not changed from what's declared in YAML. Any changes made to project, deployment, users, or teams will be overwritten, which helps ensure that all changes are made in a controlled way through the repository. Governance also becomes much easier with all your Atlas configuration managed in the same place and the same way as any of your other code. Automation becomes possible too. It's common to use continuous deployment tooling like Argo CD or Flux to automate deployment of configuration from a Git repository into Kubernetes. The operator works seamlessly with this kind of deployment tooling. This method of applying configuration limits the Kubernetes knowledge that developers actually need, making it far more self-service. This in turn empowers them and enables them to move much faster. It also improves security. Developers may still need read access into Kubernetes and possibly tools like Argo CD, but this allows them to have minimal rights since they no longer need to apply files directly into Kubernetes. And finally, though this isn't unique to the Atlas operator, the operator offers a great opportunity to standardize across teams because it's so easy for both the central team to manage the operator and for the development teams to use it and consume Atlas. It's super easy to install, whether you're a developer looking to try it out or a DevOps engineer looking to enable the development teams. We have a variety of installation options that can be used manually or automated. The easiest, I think, for manual installation is via the Atlas CLI. We've got a relatively new command that simplifies the setup by automatically creating the necessary API keys as well as installing the operator. The API keys used can be either org level or project level, depending on which you append to the command, and we'll cover that as a kind of recommendation for best practices in a minute. Alternatively, you can use Helm or kubectl apply. One thing to note, applying the custom resource definitions, the CRDs, is something that is done across an entire cluster, regardless of how many instances of a given operator you may run later. So this does require cluster admin privileges. We even have great support for using the operator to manage existing Atlas projects or deployments that already existed before you started using the operator. We have two relatively new commands in the Atlas CLI that allow you to export the configuration from Atlas in the format that's required by the operator, including being able to handle specific versions of the operator to account for any changes between versions. The first is the Atlas Kubernetes config export command, which exports to the machine where you're running the CLI. It's great for a GitOps workflow as it allows you to upload the configuration to a repository. The second is great for trying out the operator. Atlas Kubernetes config apply exports the configuration from Atlas directly into the Kubernetes cluster that you're currently connected to using whatever the active kube control context is. Either of these makes it incredibly easy to start using the operator to manage your existing Atlas infrastructure or create new deployments. We even make it super easy to connect your applications to deployments managed by the operator. As I said, for this reason, it's best if the operator is installed in the same cluster as the application. And when creating a database user, a Kubernetes secret is automatically generated containing that user's connection string. From there, it's simple to pull the connection string into your application as an environment variable, as seen here. I wanted to offer some best practices we've seen work among other customers using the Atlas operator that work really well. Providing your developers templates is a great idea. Our documentation links to a number of example custom resources we provide, but I recommend creating your own templates to share out to developers. This way they can take a template that you've provided, make minimal changes and deploy it, which makes it super self-service for the teams to get started. We often see customers using t-shirt sized templates of small, medium, and large, and sometimes there's a separate set for dev or production. They often add comments to the templates to provide developers with recommendations or options for the notable fields within, often specific to that company and the way they do things. We've seen this be so useful that in the coming quarter, we're going to be doubling down on our existing templates to provide an even better starting point for this. I mentioned org level and project level API keys. It's important to carefully consider which you use. The org level key allows that instance of the operator to manage any or all projects within the org, but that includes deleting them. You can have many instances of the operator within the same cluster, so project level API keys may work better for some. A single instance of the operator can be set to watch a team's namespaces in Kubernetes, and an API key can be created for that team's specific project. In this way, you can have multiple instances of the operator, even within the same cluster, and have them ring-fenced to reduce the potential impact that teams can have to only their project. For added security, it's good practice to store the API key in another namespace the development team can't access, unless, of course, they're the ones who created it for themselves. That could prevent them from using it for anything other than the operator. And on a similar note, when using the operator, it will overwrite changes made through any other configuration mechanism by design. So it's a great idea to limit or revoke rights of users who can access the CLI or API. This is not only great for ensuring changes are reviewed and approved before being made, but does help your security posture. Some final information about the operator. It's compatible with any flavor of Kubernetes that conforms to the CNCF's conformance standards, and that's pretty much every flavor that you'll come across. That includes base Kubernetes, OpenShift, Google GKE, Azure AKS, and Amazon EKS. The operator's been in development for over 2 years now, and generally available since June of 22. It's been in use for a lot of those 2 years by quite a few customers who are excited to jump on the beta. It has a growing team dedicated to its development and support. And it has great and ever-growing coverage of Atlas's many features. But Atlas has so many features, it's sometimes a struggle to keep up, but we're definitely getting there. And of course, we have some great public resources. Don't worry about writing these down. We're about to send those in the chat. The first of these is a link to the public docs, which provides all the information you should need to get started with or find out more about the Atlas operator. This includes guidance on installing and fully setting up the operator. The second is to an awesome repository. In it, you'll find all the essentials for a demo we did recently at MongoDB's .local event in New York. During the demo, we showed how a GitOps workflow can be built to use Kubernetes, GitHub, Argo CD, and the Atlas operator to essentially offer MongoDB Atlas as a database, as a service within an internal development platform based on Kubernetes, with all the benefits that I mentioned just now. If it's the kind of workflow that's of interest to you, I really recommend checking it out. I didn't create it, by the way, so I can applaud it as much as I like without being boastful. We're getting close to Q&A time now, but before we do, on July 25th, we're going to be doing a live streamed Q&A panel about the Atlas operator. One of our principal development advocates is going to be hosting it along with myself, Melissa Plunkett, who's one of our directors of product, and our Kubernetes engineering director, George Hansaris. So anything we don't have a chance to cover here, we'll certainly be able to dig deep into on the 25th. Full event details aren't up and available yet, but subscribe to our channel through either of these links shown on the screen and in the chat, and keep an eye out for the details. Nia.
Thanks so much, Dan, for your presentation. I'm going to drop a quick poll in the chat. Please make sure that you answer this poll to let us know how you felt about today's webinar. And before we get into Q&A, I'm going to do a quick .local promo. Before we get to Q&A, I want to invite you to attend one of our .local events, which might be coming to a city near you. When you attend, you will have the chance to meet with peers from this webinar with you, along with experts like Dan. Make sure to visit mongodb.com/local to learn more. When you register, enter code webinar50 to save 50%. I have dropped that in the chat, so make sure you register as well as answer our poll that we just dropped to know how well we did in this webinar today. Thank you so much, Dan, for your presentation. While you guys are answering this poll, please let us know if there are any questions you have in the Q&A section.
I can see lots of responses coming in on the poll. So obviously lots of you are engaged. I'm guessing, though, I've done a great job of explaining everything. We've got no questions coming in at the moment. So if you do have any, please fire them in and you'll be top of the queue.
Yes. Please ask any questions that you do have, and love that you're answering the poll. We'll definitely give it a couple of minutes. and we'll be here on standby if you have any questions.
While people are answering the poll and submitting any questions, I'll answer kind of some unspoken questions. Of question 4 in the poll, we asked whether there's anything that you'd like to see covered in more depth. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, I can kind of explain some of the elements in high level detail at least. So why is it valuable to use it? The main way it's valuable to use is kind of, as I alluded to earlier in the presentation, if you are using kind of exclusively Kubernetes tooling and you're deploying your stack into Kubernetes, but you want to leverage MongoDB Atlas, this allows you to avoid using any non-Kubernetes technology or non-Kubernetes specific technology like Terraform or something. We also support the CDK, we've got Terraform, we've got CloudFormation as well, and obviously we've got the API, the CLI, the UI, and all the other acronyms. That's kind of why it's valuable to use, though. It allows you to carry on using Git repo, Argo CD, tooling like that to deploy into Kubernetes and have that become your way of managing Atlas as well.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, no worries.
We do have a question actually that's in the chat. There's 2 in the chat, but we are directing them to the Q&A panel now from Kazi and Seb.
Yeah. I can pull them out the chat, but for any other questions, please do put them into the Q&A. It just makes it a little bit easier for us. So the first one was, do we have any high-level documents about Atlas Kubernetes? So about the Atlas operator, you can find those on the link in the chat. The link to our docs pages, it's somewhere up there in the chat. Yeah, so please go and have a look at that. Actually, are we missing the link to the docs pages for the Atlas operator?
Yeah, some of them linked, some of them didn't link. Let me copy
Okay.
it.
Yeah, we'll get the link in there for the Atlas docs. And there's not sort of documents that you can download on there, but there's a lot of documentation about the Atlas operator and how it works. There's the link just gone into the docs.
I'm going to relink it to the doc.
Okay. Yeah, so that'll be in the chat in a second.
Yes.
We also asked, if you're already using IAC or CDK, is there any pros of using this operator? Essentially, no. The CDK, Terraform, the Atlas operator, they're all based on the Atlas API. So they're kind of intermediaries to using that. And it's just all about what is most native to you. Terraform is very popular. So if you're already using that for some element of your deployments for your stack, then by all means use that for the Atlas, for configuring Atlas as well. Or same for the CDK. But if you do want a setup for a given application, a given cluster, and a given project, then you can choose to use the Atlas operator to keep it super clean and super Kubernetes specific. But it's entirely at your discretion. We're trying to offer as many kind of options as possible to suit what you're already doing. There's a question in the Q&A. Do we have any other available YAML for testing? So the Atlas operator repository is linked from in the docs, and there are various samples in there. Depending on where you go in the docs, on whichever page, there'll be a link to various sample resources. And from there, you can kind of navigate and see what other resources are available there. So there's various samples for kind of testing and having a go. There's a question, is that GitHub code available for testing in different mode? sorry, you'll have to clarify what sort of different mode you mean. I'm not sure what you mean. Cool. Unless well, if we have any other questions, then please get them into the Q&A. In the meantime, I'll kind of carry on talking about that question 4 in the poll, because it got quite a lot of responses. The most popular one was actually how to integrate it into other systems. Essentially, if you're talking about systems like GitHub and Argo CD, which is kind of the most popular pairing that we actually see, but this applies to other tools like Flux and so on. There's no kind of direct integration needed, really. As I recommended, we suggest you provide templates to your users, but that really just enables the developers to get a jumping start. Essentially, they can create the custom resources, so the project custom resource, the deployment custom resource, any users that they want to access that database in the repository, as long as they have something like Argo CD or Flux deploying those custom resources into Kubernetes, although that can, of course, be done manually through kube control apply. The operator will pick up those resources or see those resources, is more accurate, if they're applied in a namespace that the operator is watching, and it will then call the Kubernetes, the Atlas API and make those changes. So there's no kind of direct integration needed, really. It makes it super simple. In the same way you can apply any kind of resource type into Kubernetes using whatever mechanisms you use. You can do the same for the Atlas operator, and the operator just provides that kind of translation between those resources in Kubernetes and Atlas configuration. So questions come in, is that GitHub code available for testing in different deployment type? I'm not sure what other deployment type you could mean. I'm sorry. And then there's the second most voted response to that 4th question is how to manage specific Atlas features and capabilities. That would be a long session, mainly because there's so many Atlas features and capabilities, and we support most of them with the Atlas operator. It's all covered in the docs. There's reference docs about the various custom resources we offer, and most of the features are kind of sub entities within the custom resources. So it's all about kind of looking at the relevant section in the references, finding the corresponding entries that you need in order to make that work, and kind of setting those. Some of those are covered more explicitly in kind of start to finish, achieve X kind of guides. But some of them are just covered as reference because they are just like a 1 entry or 2 or 3 entries required to make it work. Atlas, backing up deployments backup has its own custom resource, and so there kind of is specific documentation covering that. Obviously, backup is one of the bigger elements to managing any database.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for your presentation and the live Q&A. We will be wrapping up now. If there are any other questions, I have dropped a link in the chat to the MongoDB community forums, so please make sure you ask your questions there. We will also be sharing the recording of this webinar along with the links that were dropped in the chat within that email. So please keep a lookout for that and reach out if you have any questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today's webinar.
Thank you very much.